So if you don't mind, I'll just stand up at the front here when I speak, and please, I hope someone will stop me if I talk for too long. It's a bad habit of professors to go over time. So today I'm going to speak a little bit about the current research agenda in the international literature on Indonesia, on Indonesian politics and democracy. So the structure of this presentation, I'll talk very briefly about Indonesia's democratic success and the dangers of democratic decline. I won't speak for long on this topic because many of you understand this topic even better than I do. But I will then address very briefly what I think has been the dominant pattern of Indonesian electoral politics and democratic politics over the last 10 or 15 years. That is a political cartel at the top and clientelistic political arrangements at the bottom. Then address the question of whether Indonesia's political pattern is changing, especially since the 2014 presidential election, but now also the 2019 election. I think we can all agree that something new is emerging in Indonesian politics, and the politics of polarization is becoming more evident than it was before. Of course, many of the old patterns are still visible, but something new is also emerging. And then I want to briefly mention some of the potential research trends, new topics, which I think would be very fruitful for Indonesian academics, PhD students, and others to address and to publish on internationally. I think there are many opportunities for Indonesian scholars of politics to make a much bigger contribution to comparative politics internationally. So, of course, the point we need to start on when addressing this issue, and which is an important part of the context for the rest of my presentation, is that Indonesia's democratic success has been very extraordinary. One of the great success stories of the third wave of democratization, that wave of democratization that began globally in the mid-1970s in countries of Southern Europe, Greece, Spain, and other countries, but then gradually swept through Latin America, through parts of Africa, through parts of Asia, and really peaked around the time of Indonesia's transition from the new order. So 98, 99 was really about the peak of the third wave of democratization, and Indonesia was one of the most important countries to experience that third wave. And it's got to be said as well, one of the most successful countries at that time of the third wave. That democratization of Indonesia was not predicted by analysts, and the results have been much greater than anybody expected. So, when I began my PhD studies on Indonesian politics, and my topic was democratization in the early 1990s, many of my advisors and senior academics in Australia were very skeptical. They thought, why are you doing democratization in Indonesia? There will be no democratization in Indonesia. But of course, as we know, just a few years later, it was the end of the new order. Since that time, as we know, 5 very successfully run national elections. Again, my congratulations to the KPU for their great achievement this year. And of course, many local elections have been run. Of course, there are problems here and there, but overall, the record has been extremely successful. How have scholars understood Indonesia's political transformation over the last 2 decades? The overarching theoretical framework has really been provided by democratization theory. As I'm sure many of you know, that's a very big body of literature. You have agency-based models, structural models, and so on. There are different foci in that literature, some people focusing on elections, some on parties, some on demilitarization, and so on. But overall, that has been the sort of the grand narrative of the academic discourse on Indonesian politics for the last 20 years. In fact, even some of the very dominant, very influential theories, such as the oligarchy thesis, which have emerged and influenced discussion on Indonesian politics are really a response to democratization theory, to the hegemony of democratization theory. That's been the overarching theoretical framework through which scholars of comparative politics have understood Indonesian politics for the last 2 decades. What we need to consider now as political scientists is that the global climate has changed. So the global context of Indonesian democracy is now very different. So as I said before, Indonesia's democratic transformation occurred at the very high point of the third wave of democratization, at the end of a process of a period in which many more countries became democratic than became authoritarian. Over the last 10 years, that context has reversed. So for example, Freedom House argued or claims that over the last 13 years, there's been a reverse democratic wave. So a period of democratic decline has begun internationally. And there's debate about this, of course, in the literature, and the different indices give slightly different measures. Some are slightly more optimistic, some are slightly more pessimistic. But there's no doubt that the international context for Indonesia's democratization is very different now. So, for example, in the scholarly literature on American politics, for the first time in my lifetime, there is serious debate about the dangers to the stability of US democracy and whether the Trump presidency signals the beginning of a period of democratic decline in the United States. It's a very different climate from 20 years ago when Indonesia began its process of democratization. One thing that's very obvious when you look at these countries which are experiencing democratic decline, countries such as Turkey, Hungary, and other countries, is that the pattern of democratic decline in the contemporary world is very different to what happened prior to the third wave of democratization. So prior to the third wave in the 1950s, the 60s, the 70s, the typical actor promoting democratic decline were external actors outside of the formal democratic political system, typically militaries via the route of a military coup, sometimes armed or revolutionary groups. In the contemporary period, the typical pattern is democratic decline happening at the hands of elected, often populist political leaders. So Viktor Orban in Hungary, Erdogan in Turkey, and so on. So leaders who get elected, who are popular, and yet, once elected, take steps to curtail democratic rights and freedoms. If we are honest, we have to see that some of these trends are becoming visible in Indonesia too. And so for the last 5 years, the focus of a lot of the international publications on Indonesia, if you look at the journals, who's publishing on Indonesian politics internationally, the focus of many authors is shifting away from democratization, from democratic consolidation, to the dangers of democratic decline. Nobody is saying that Indonesia is already in a period of steep democratic decline, but obviously the dangers are present and the beginnings of that process are visible. And we see this in many different fields. I don't need to go into them a lot here, but the emergence of authoritarian populist politicians, the rise of illiberal, majoritarian identity politics, and the use by government of increasingly repressive measures against opponents. For example, the revival of makar charges, treason charges against critics of the government. And this has really been a phenomenon primarily of the last 5 years or so. So that, I think, will be a big part of the debate about the character of Indonesian politics in the scholarly literature internationally. So that's the point I'm really trying to make here, that we are at a period of change in the scholarly debate and the theoretical discussions about Indonesian literature. and about Indonesian politics, and moreover about the nature of comparative politics globally. And there are many opportunities for Indonesian scholars to contribute in a much bigger way than previously about not only about changes in Indonesia, but in ways which have implications for global discussion of what is the major trend internationally in political affairs. Many topics have been introduced to discuss what might be driving the contemporary democratic decline, but there is not yet scholarly consensus on what the critical causal factors are. What is causing democracy in so many countries to gradually decline? Different scholars have pinpointed different factors, but we don't yet agree. So some scholars look at the rise of economic inequality, not between nations, but within nations, as a critical factor. Others look at the effects of new media, social media, and so on, the effect that this has on increasing political polarization. And a new research agenda is also the middle classes, whereas the middle classes typically in the past used to be seen as an agent of democratization. There's now questions whether there's been some shift taking place globally, and middle classes are increasingly embracing authoritarian and popular solutions, perhaps as a result of increasing economic inequality. Public opinion is an interesting topic to look at here. For example, there's a big debate being going on in the pages of the Journal of Democracy about whether decline in support for democracy in advanced and consolidated democratic countries like Australia, America, and so on signifies a danger to democratic consolidation even in such countries. And of course, there's a huge new literature on populism. And these are all areas in which Indonesian scholars need to really be engaging and publishing internationally, to take a leading part in these international debates. So Indonesia's democratic model. I'll be very brief here because I'm really just giving a literature review, and many of you will know this literature, and indeed you've contributed to it. So as we said, Indonesia has been in many ways a great successful case of democratization, developing a highly successful multi-party and participatory system. But one of the key characteristics of that system, and this has really been a contribution primarily by scholars like Dan Slater, Dodi Ambardi and others, has been a tendency for a sort of cartel-like formation of government at the centre. That is an extremely broadly participatory model of governance, in which most political parties participate through the form of these koalisi pelangi. Now we know under SBY's government, of course, that the PDIP did not participate, and that there have been opposition parties as well during the Jokowi government. But overall, these are very oversized coalitions. And in Pilkada too, we see very all-inclusive coalitions, very broad coalitions in which ideology and identity-based alignments play little role. So PDIP, in many places, for example, will go into coalition with PKS, or at least it has done historically. And the argument here has been a lot of the motivation for this form of politics has really been shared access to patronage. So why do political parties with different political outlooks combine to cooperate in government? Partly it's because of the access to the patronage resources they get through government, the opportunities to fund their political party activities. And we see this also in the pattern of corruption that is sometimes revealed through the DPR. It's quite an unusual pattern actually, because usually the usual pattern is that we simply see corruption on the part of a single governing party. But in Indonesia we've often seen, what's the istilahnya? Korupsi berjamaah, where all the different political parties participate in sharing out the results of corruption through the Komisi and the DPR and so on. I think everyone can think of many different cases where that happened. And the thing to stress is this is quite an unusual pattern internationally. This is not a typical pattern either of corruption or political coalition forming in democratic governments. just to give you one insight into how this works, last year, in cooperation with Burhanuddin Muhtadi and colleagues from Lembaga Survey Indonesia, we did a survey of members of DPRD Provinsi, so a nationally representative sample of DPRD members from across all provinces except for 2 or 3. We asked them many, many questions about their political attitudes, about their political parties, about political ideology, about their attitudes to democracy, and so on and so forth. The publications are still in process, still awaiting the revised and resubmission decision from the journal, so please pray for us. But for example, we asked members of the parties in the DPRD, do you agree with the proposition that pada pokoknya semua partai di Indonesia sama ideologinya? And the result, as you can see there, is that a majority agreed with that, 54%. So 54% of party representatives in the DPRD Provinsi agree that basically parties are all the same ideologically. That's a really high number internationally. If you ask that in most countries of the world, party leaders will say, oh, of course, different parties have different ideologies. That's the whole purpose of a political party. And we've got a very similar result as well when we asked them about their policy platforms. Just under 50% agreed that, well, yeah, of course, parties also basically have the same policies or the same platforms. Again, it's a very unusual result internationally because in most countries of the world, party leaders think of their parties as being based around distinctive policy positions. The other side of this system, of course, has been the predominance of clientelistic politics at the grassroots. And over the last 5 years, I've been very lucky to work with a number of colleagues, Mas Mada Sukmajati at Gadjah Mada and many other friends and colleagues at Gadjah Mada University. Then with my colleague, Ward Berenschot from the Netherlands, and also been able to work with Burhanuddin Muhtadi with his PhD at ANU last year. So we now know quite a lot about how clientelistic politics works at the grassroots. And as we all know, especially the shift to the open list proportional representation system in 2009 meant that candidates from the same parties have to compete against each other to get the maximal number of personal votes. The result has been an increase in vote buying and other forms of clientelistic politics. And by clientelistic politics, we mean politics in which there's an exchange of material benefit for political support. The material benefit might be in the form of sembako or serangan fajar, or what's very common in Indonesia is these collective gifts, like sumbangan for perbaikan infrastruktur di desa, for rumah ibadah or whatever it is. But very different forms of clientelistic politics have become quite dominant in Indonesian politics at election times. I think we all know that. According to Burhan's research, based on surveys, about between 1/4 and 1/3 of all voters received cash payments in the 2014 elections. So between 47 and 62 million voters. And we've done a survey this year. It's gone down a little bit, but overall it's similar. A similar proportion of voters are receiving gifts of one kind or another from political candidates, which is one of the highest numbers in the world, actually. So it's a very high figure. And we know, of course, that this is what we would expect. It's quite predictable if you use open list proportional representation. That's very clear in the literature, actually. If you have an electoral system which encourages a personal vote and produces intra-party competition, one very likely result is increased clientelism. We know a lot about this. I won't talk much about this, but we know that vote buying and clientelistic politics varies according to the level of elections and the number of voters. So it's very common in DPRD Kabupaten Kota, for example, much less common in Pilpres. Depending on the region, also actually very common in Pilkades as well. We also know how this form of politics is organized. Increasingly in the arrangements around elections, political parties are marginal and individual candidates instead form their team success, their success teams, which in the comparative literature we would think of as brokerage structures, which are really based on personal connections usually, not on party organization. So at the grassroots, the political system, the electoral system that Indonesia has adopted is really quite compatible with that system of cartel politics at the top, because both are based on personal connections, clientelistic exchange, rather than ideological organization and party. The negative effects of this system, I think, are also quite familiar to us, so I don't need to talk about this very much. But we know from talking to candidates that this form of high-cost politics is one contributing factor to political corruption. If you talk to candidates, they often say that one of their primary goals, if they get elected into the DPRD, is to balik modal, to return the investment that they made during the campaign. And the result is that we get less programmatic politics, we get less focused on policy, because the elected representatives are more busy in balik modal than thinking about distinctive policies. And of course it undermines opposition to a national government, because political party representatives are really much more interested in getting access to patronage rather than debating with the government. So it draws people towards the government rather than towards opposition. But we've got to remember, 5 minutes, I might go over time. Oh well, maklum lah seorang profesor. What about the benefits of the system? Does it make sense to talk about this system having any benefits? Would anyone like to volunteer? Anyone have any ideas? I think one of the big benefits of this system actually is that Indonesia has had a very stable political system. Because the logic of the system is to draw political actors, political parties into government, into cooperation with government, you don't get too much instability. So it's true that this system has had many negative consequences, but we shouldn't overlook the positive results as well. Every electoral system that we choose has both positive and negative consequences. If Indonesia went back to a closed list proportional representation system, we know that would have it might have some positive consequences. It will probably reduce retail vote buying, but it will probably increase the amount of corruption inside parties as candidates try to purchase positions on voter lists. And it might also increase ideological polarization. So that's the model that Indonesia has developed over the last 20 years of post-Suharto democracy. What's happening now? Well, I think we can all agree, or I hope we can all agree, that Indonesia seems to be entering a new phase, and that the 2019 election in particular, at least at the presidential election level, was associated with increased ideological or identity-based polarization. I think we all feel that. If you look at the results of the 2019 election and you compare that to the 1955 election, you can see Prabowo won basically everywhere where Masyumi won in 1955. It's quite a clear correlation, actually. Moreover, there's this process of geographic polarization, where in general, the places where Jokowi won in 2014, he won by more in 2019. So Bali went up from, what was it, 80-something to 90-something%, and likewise, Prabowo went in Sumatra Barat from, was it 70-something to 90-something, I forget the numbers. But you can see that pattern. Everywhere where Jokowi won, he won more in 2019, and vice versa. And we also, in some of the exit polls, we see these amazing results. So this is the exit poll by Indikator Politik, and you can see that there, according to that poll, 97% of non-Muslims voted for Jokowi, which again, comparatively speaking, is just an amazing number, that there is such concentration of identity-based voting in this election. It's very rare internationally to find something like that. And yet, we look at the organizational affiliation of Ormas Islam, we can see similar patterns. Not as strong, but also comparable. So Muhammadiyah voters overwhelmingly going to Prabowo, NU, especially going to Jokowi. Especially when you do a cross-tab and you look at orang NU yang suku Jawa is very, very high. So most of the NU people who voted for Prabowo actually are from outside of Java. And this is also an interesting result. It shows that polarization is really beginning to take place in Indonesia. So one of the typical surveys, questions we ask in other countries, I don't know if you can read that, but one of the typical surveys we ask in countries experiencing polarization like the United States are these questions like, you know, if you're a Democrat, would you be happy if your daughter marries a Republican? In America, yeah, Democrats and Republicans don't want their children to marry each other. But the question we ask here is, kalau Anda mau pindah ke tempat tinggal yang baru, is it important for you to have memilih tempat yang fasilitas umumnya bagus? That's about 90%, of course, right? You want to go where there's good schools, good medical services. Is it important to go somewhere where you're close to your family? Also very high, about 87%. But we also ask, is it important for you to go somewhere where kebanyakan orang memilih calon presiden yang sama? The people who said setuju atau sangat setuju is 39%. So about 40% of the population says it's very important to live somewhere where people support the same president. So that's actually very high. It's actually quite a high level of ideological polarization. Now, of course, if we ask the same question in 1 year's time, maybe people won't care so much, but at the moment, it's actually quite polarized. Even about 1/3 of people say it's important to live in a place where they choose the same party. Of course, again, we've got to think about both costs and benefits of this system. On the one hand, increasing ideological polarization potentially at least produces more programmatic competition, more policy-oriented political competition. But the potential risks are also quite great, because there's a lot of comparative literature which says that polarization is often one step before democratic breakdown. Because when ideological polarization happens, when you have perkubuan in politics, often members of one group will value hurting their opponents more than upholding the democratic system as a whole. And that's why often polarization is associated with democratic decline. Next, please. So, the new research agenda. I'll be just 2 more minutes, I think. So actually, if we compare the old pattern to the new pattern, so the old pattern, cartel politics, clientelistic politics, to the new pattern, more ideological polarization and the dangers of democratic breakdown, actually in both areas, there's a lot of potential research topics where Indonesian researchers can make a big impact internationally, and where we still don't really understand what's going on in a detailed level in Indonesian politics. For example, as far as I know, we don't yet have a really good PhD or a good book or even a good journal article which in a really detailed way looks at how political parties at the centre, either through the ministries or through the DPR, really make use of patronage resources to fund their operations. Everyone knows this happens, but we don't have systematic evidence. Likewise, at the grassroots, there's a lot of questions we can ask about the nature of clientelistic networks. Next slide, please. But in the new Indonesia, this new Indonesia of growing ideological polarization and potential for democratic decline. Remember, I'm just saying potential for democratic decline. I don't think it's inevitable. But we do need to start paying attention to new political phenomena as well. So, for example, the return of the security forces as potential political actors. When I was a PhD student, everyone in Australia who studied Indonesian politics had to really closely follow, who was who in the military hierarchy. Yeah, who's the Pangdam Jaya, for example. afiliasinya kemana, apakah Beni atau ke sini, merah putih atau hijau. But in recent years, I don't even really know who the Pangam Jaya is anymore. We're not interested in that topic anymore, but I think we need to start rethinking that and start paying attention once more to what's going on in the military, what's going on in the police forces. We need to know much more about ideological polarization and its depth. There's big opportunities there for quantitative research. Middle class politics, yeah, some people have written on this, but I think we can be much more systematic. Authoritarian personality, for example, for people who want to research from a political psychology point of view, and social media and hoaxes. So there's many important topics, I think, which we've been neglecting, which are open as a new research agenda for Indonesian political science. Thank you. I think that's the last one, yeah. So thank you very much, thank you for your patience.
Thank you, Professor Edward Aspinall, for delivering your materials about elections and democracy in Indonesia. Now I'm inviting the head of Department of Political Science, Mr. Julian Pasha, to give placards to Professor Edward Aspinall. Please